In this second devotion on James 4, we're going to look at the second great enemy of our faith, the world. In verse 4, James tells us that friendship with the world makes us enemies of God. The word translated friendship there comes from the Greek word phileo. So James is saying that love of this world, that if we love this world, we are an enemy of God. In 1 John, John uses the word agape, that if we have an agape love for the world. In New Testament times, those words were often used interchangeably. Sometimes there's a difference, but I think in this case, there's not a great difference. He says that love of the world makes us an enemy of God. And the world is simply human society apart from God. Are we running our world, our values, how we do business, how we do government, how we have criminal justice system, are all these things apart from the values of God, the leadership of God? Loving that type of structure, living that way, makes you an enemy of God. And I think we need to understand how this process happens. It doesn't happen overnight that we become lovers of this world. I think the first step in the process is becoming a friend of the world. Here we mean this differently than James did. I mean just becoming an acquaintance with the world. I think of Lot. Remember when Lot separated from Abraham, he was enticed by looking at the world, and he wanted the better place. He saw the cities, he saw the plain, and he thought this was a better place for him to be. And this world is set up to tempt us. The world appeals to our flesh. Our flesh has this selfish drive, and the world appeals to that constantly. And the first step in the process is becoming a friend with the world. Then we actually do fall in love with the world. This is the warning we see in 1 John, that becoming a lover of the world separates us from God. We see this play out in Lot's life, right? When the two angels came to warn them about the destruction and tried to get them to leave, Lot, his sons-in-laws, his family did not want to leave the city. They were so in love with the city, they wanted to stay there. After we fall in love with the city, or the world, we actually become conformed to the world. Paul warns us in Romans 12 not to do this, that we should be transformed. But we see this play out in Lot's life, right? He offers his daughters to the crowd. Later, his daughters in the cave do some heinous, unspeakable acts because they've become conformed to the world. They've allowed the world's views on sexuality, on marriage, on income, on your career, on how we spend the time to influence everything they do. They make all their judgments based on the world's values. They've become conformed to the world. And we need to understand that being conformed to the world leads to condemnation. In 1 Corinthians, Paul tells us that God disciplines us so that we might not be condemned along with the world. Look what happens with Lot's wife. She's so in love with her life that she tries to hold on to it. She looks back. This is what Jesus references in Luke. Right after he talks about Lot's wife, he says, whoever would try to save his life will lose it. That we love the world so much that we can become condemned by the world. Well, how do we avoid this? How do we not be influenced by the world, not conform to the world? One option would be to leave the world. We see this kind of play out in the idea of monasteries, right? That we remove ourselves from the world. There's a modern push for this called the Benedict option, that as believers we ought to form our own communities and pull out of the world. But I don't think that's a really good biblical answer to this issue. Rather, we should take comfort in some things. We know in John 16, Jesus tells us that he has overcome the world. Then John, in his letter in 1 John, tells us that if we belong to Jesus, we have overcome the world. So we need to live in light of that we have overcome the world. In John 17, Jesus says this. Listen to these words. Jesus says in verse 14, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. So the first thing to remember is that we're not of the world. We don't belong to the world. We're not conformed to the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is true. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. I'm sure we all are familiar with the phrase that we are in the world but not of the world. But one commentator says that really kind of falls short. That often we take that and separates us from the world. Here Jesus is actually saying, and this commentator phrases it this way, that we're not of but sent. We're not of the world. We're not conformed to the world, but we are sent into the world. As Jesus was sent by the Father, he has sent us into this world. We are to be light. We are to be salt. We are to be the city on the hill to the world. Why can we do that? Because Jesus has overcome the world, and therefore we have overcome the world. So today, live sent, not of the world, but sent into the world to be light, to be salt, to be the city on the hill, to proclaim the good news.